Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at msdynamicsworld.com. On this episode, we are talking Dynamics 365 Business Central permissions and security projects. If that sounds awfully specific, well, it is, but this is a chance to really close out a discussion that started with an article on the same topic from one of our guests, Cari Corozza. She wrote about this topic, then followed it up with a great webcast where she explored it from another perspective, and now she's here with another friend of ours from New View Strategies, Cynthia Priebe, to wrap things up by discussing each of the who, how, why, what of these projects and some of the long-term considerations that go along with them. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get into it. All right, Cynthia, Cari, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Yes, absolutely.
So really glad to have a chance to have this conversation to follow up on, Cari, your article and your presentation about Business Central permissions and security and how to structure them into a project. And this is really a chance for, me to ask you a few questions about what you've already shown and explained and laid out for readers and for attendees. I wanted to start just with a bit of setup from my own understanding. Maybe it's something that others would wonder about too, which is sort of how common it is to structure permissions and security into its own project when it comes to a Business Central implementation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And kind of what we'll do probably is I'll add my input, Cynthia will add her input, because we both have, different experiences with permissions and security projects. So to your point of, making it its own project, in my experience, I think sometimes companies might underestimate the amount of effort and time and testing that needs to be put into security and permissions. We've seen companies where they say, we want security and permissions to be right, but we don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And unfortunately, that's, usually not going to happen. It is kind of a big undertaking, especially if you want it to be right and accurate. So in our experience, it does usually turn into its own project, even if it wasn't necessarily anticipated to be at first by that admin department. So yeah, what we've seen is, or at least what I've seen, I think, is that it does kind of morph into its own project again, even if that necessarily wasn't the original intent. So I don't know if Cynthia has anything to add on that.
Well, and I think by making it its own project, it gets its due diligence. It will have a plan. It will have someone in charge. It will have people involved, which is what we're going to talk about today. And if you just treat it like something else that needs to be done whenever we have time, it's not going to get you the results that you need, which is that you have users accessing and using the part of the system that they should and not accessing and using the part of the system that they shouldn't. So I think it's important to consider it a project.
Yeah, I think that also kind of brings up a good point of when companies decide to implement permissions. I think a lot of companies go into maybe a BC implementation and say, okay, we want permissions and security to be part of this implementation process. But I also think that some companies think, we'll implement, we'll get everything set, and then we'll undertake the permissions and security project, maybe 3 months in because it's too much at implementation time. So there's pros and cons of both, and neither is necessarily more right than the other. But I think, the time at which a business decides it's time to implement permissions and security might vary as well.
Well, and I might disagree with you a little bit on that, Cari, because if you are using NAV now and you're moving to BC, one of the huge benefits that you get with Business Central is if you do not have permission to an object or a function or a page, it is not visible to you in your role center. So if part of the goal of implementing a system is to make it easier for the users to do their job, one of the best ways to do that is to do what I call reduce the noise on a page. So if I go into a role center and I only see what I have access to, that's going to be a lot less confusing or complicated than if I open that same page and there's a bunch of stuff in there that somebody says, oh, don't worry about that. You're not going to go there. You don't need to do that. So I would like to say that we need to think of security permissions as something that is part of our implementation. Now, to Cari's point, I agree with her. It can be done later, and you may decide to do it later, but you need to look at the pros and the cons.
Right. And I think, I do agree with Cynthia on that. And what we've actually seen in the past sometimes is companies that decide, we'll do it 3-6 months down the line after the implementation. They do run into issues right after that implementation because users are not necessarily maliciously going in and changing things they shouldn't, but they don't know not to change these. Maybe they get a message saying, you can't post this journal entry because your posting dates aren't open. And they say, oh, let me go change my posting dates. So the users aren't necessarily doing it intentionally, but just to be able to keep them from those areas of the system that they shouldn't be changing is definitely important to have in place. So yeah, I think some companies realize, oh, maybe we should do this sooner than later if they do run into those issues.
Well, and just one little kind of funny note too is it's usually your best employees that get in trouble because your best employees say, hey, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get my job done. And that's wonderful. But now they might be doing things, like you said, where they're changing posting dates and they shouldn't be.
Yeah. So hopefully that kind of answers the question, Jason, of, if it's typical to make it its own project and at what point.
Yeah, and I can imagine just a lot of difficult scenarios if you don't put that right level of attention on it. And I can certainly see why structuring it as a project gets you a lot of that, as you've already kind of explained, and all the good things that can come out of that, which is what I'm looking forward to hearing more about here. You mentioned including users in this kind of project. Can you talk more about? I mean, that it seems kind of obvious because you've already sort of said it, but I mean, are there cases where you're not, where organizations don't want to include their end users in defining their permissions, or just maybe don't think to?
That's a great question. So again, I'll kind of give my input and then let Cynthia add hers. But kind of what I have seen is that most companies really, in my experience, don't consider incorporating the end users because it's more seen as like an IT or an admin project for Business Central. So some of the reasons that we advocate for including end users are based on our experience of successful permissions implementations with those end users. And one of the actual reasons to do it is that it can actually shorten your timeline of the permissions and security implementation from 4.5 months down to just 2. Cynthia and I actually mapped this out kind of on an Excel document. And the way that that works is rather than just, one department or one person being in charge of that entire project, we can actually kind of hand off that work to other departments, have those end users working on different phases of the project while that admin is planning for the next phase. So kind of phasing in those different departments in the different steps of the project can help to shorten that timeline. Cynthia, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, so if we even talk about, Cari, one of the projects that we most recently worked on, we had a situation where we had customer service people that needed to determine, and we'll talk a little more detail about how we plan this, but needed to determine what it was that were going to be their permissions, what were needed. And you can get those individuals working on that. And then when they move on to the next step in the process, which would be outlining what they're going to be working on, you can get the sales team working on step 1. When they move on to step 2, then you can get the production team working on step 1. And when they move on to step 2, etc. So like Cari said, you're taking this, what would be 4.5 months linearly, I can't even say that word, in a line, and you are allowing it to overlap. Now, from my perspective, if I'm talking to someone in the C-suite and you can say, okay, we have a project that's going to take 4.5 months, or we can say we have a project that's going to take 2 months, which one do you think they want? The project that's going to take 2 months, exactly, because it's time is money. Time is money.
The only pushback I could imagine there is if you tell them that you're going to need to bring in all these different people from different departments at the same time, that they might resist that somehow. No?
Interestingly enough, what you can show by bringing in the multiple users is that each user's contribution is less. So basically, they can still get their regular work done, which kind of leads us to our next point.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'll add on that is when we say include end users, we don't necessarily mean include every single end user in Business Central, but kind of pick those key, trusted, experienced users from each department. So maybe you have a finance department of 10 people. You pick 1 to 2 key users to help with that project. So it's not including every single end user, but kind of just those key users. So hopefully that too would help convince them that it's not going to be everyone in the company tied up with this project. But yes, like Cynthia said, that kind of leads us into our second point of why to include them is it lessens that workload and that burden on everyone. It's a huge undertaking on top of regular work for IT or admin to do this security and permissions project. And we do want to make it a priority because we want it to be right. We want it to be effective. And if it's, too much work for one single person or 2 people, you take that risk that maybe it's not going to be done quite as well. So when we include all of those different end users, we're actually lessening the workload for everyone, which led us to getting it done in a shorter amount of time.
And I think it's lesser frustration. So if you're looking at, okay, I have to do all of my regular work and I have to do this permission related work for our security project, if it's all planned out and well organized, it's also worked into the regular routine. And again, no one person is taking 40 hours in a week to work on security permissions. If you take these key users and they just have to take maybe 2 hours a week, and you're going to get this project done instead of 4.5 months in 2 months with less time away from these key users doing their regular job, it's really a win-win. And it does net out that way. We've seen it time and time again when you take this approach.
And just say, for example, that a company decided not to take this approach. At some point, probably those end users are going to end up spending their time anyway on trying to help work with IT or admin to resolve the issues. Because if those end users were not involved in the planning process, it's kind of hard for the admin person to know exactly what job tasks they're performing and exactly what permissions they need. So a lot of times what we'll see is if end users are not included, well, then those permissions are implemented in production and there's just all sorts of issues because people can't do their jobs. So for me, I think it's more beneficial to take the time up front to work with those end users, have them understand the process, work through the issues before they're in production so that they can continue to do their jobs effectively. Users get very, very frustrated when today they can do their jobs in production and tomorrow they go in and they're getting permissions errors. So I think it helps alleviate that amount of time that's needed on troubleshooting when users do come across those issues.
Well, and you also brought up something interesting, Cari, there too. It's less time. Because if I'm the IT person and I have to figure out what the customer service people are doing so that I can set up security and permissions when I can just have the customer service person do their thing, that's way less time.
Right. And often what we see is a company will go to undertake a project for security and permissions and they say, okay, we're going to start with finance. And then they say, well, what does finance do? Oh, let's go ask finance. So it's almost like those users are going to need to be included anyway at some point. But again, I think it's just better to do it in advance, include them in the planning and the process rather than too far down the line. So the users that know best what they do are those users performing those tasks. So to me, it almost seems, kind of silly to not include those users in the process when they know their jobs. I don't know everything Cynthia does on a daily basis. I don't know everything the rest of my team members do on a daily basis in Business Central. So it's almost impossible for that admin person to know every single thing that those users are doing without asking them.
Well, and I think too, when you take a project like this and you have kind of an us and them situation, oh, it's IT, it's admin, and you start involving the people that are being impacted by what IT or admin are doing, and you're asking for help, people want to help. They may be a little bit overwhelmed at first and thinking, oh, this is going to take so much time. But when people are involved and everybody's working towards the same goal and you're trying to help other people, it really leads us into our last key point of why to include the end users, and that it actually strengthens the relationship between the departments because it's less of an us and them, it's an us, right? Everybody's working towards the same end.
Yes, completely agree, Cynthia. I think sometimes too, if the end users don't know what's happening in the background, they go in and all they know is, well, yesterday I could do this and now I can't. I can't do my job. It's almost like they think that, that the admin is trying to lock them out of things or, keep them from doing things. And that is part of the intent, but the other part is to allow everyone to do their jobs without either accidentally or intentionally changing things or doing things that they shouldn't be. So it's not, just admin trying to lock everyone out of everything. It's giving those permissions so that people can still do their jobs. And I think when the users see that, okay, they're really trying their best to give us these permissions to make it easier on everyone, they understand that, and there's just kind of more of that trust, I think, interdepartmentally. And you just work a little bit more now with your IT or admin too. So I think that just strengthens the bond a little bit. Maybe those users now feel more comfortable going to them with permissions issues or other issues of the system as well.
Well, and it just reminds me of a situation we had where we were running through the testing. We had Carl was in customer service and he was testing through that he was able to do his work. And he reached out and he said, I can't do this. I can't go in and change this value related to the item that I'm trying to use on this order. And it turned out Carl shouldn't have been doing that, but he didn't realize that because don't forget, a lot of times when this is happening, it's not just somebody upgrading from or re-implementing from NAV to Business Central. It's somebody coming over from another system. So not only are you testing the permissions that someone has, but you're also helping to confirm and define their role in the new system. So in that case, what Carl was trying to change on the item, he always did in their old system. But now that they moved to Business Central, they didn't want Carl doing that because actually Susan was the product manager. And if Carl ran into that problem, he was supposed to reach out to Susan because there were some other things that she needed to check first before she would make that change. Or maybe Carl, I think actually, Cari, in that case, Carl needed to be picking a different item. Because in their old system, they had one item and they would change an attribute. In their new system, they had two different items.
That's a very good point. I think on the opposite side of that spectrum as well, maybe Carl was supposed to be able to make that change, but maybe he just forgot to record it in the recording process. So when we were doing this project as well with the end users and they were testing, it almost became like a game for them. They'd test through the permission sets and say maybe that they went to add dimensions on a customer and they got, a dimensions permission error. Maybe they don't know exactly what it is, but they can see something about dimensions in the customer card. They would think to themselves, why can't I do this? And then they'd think, oh my gosh, I forgot to record this in the recording process. So it's like it became a game for them to figure out like, oh, what did I miss when I was doing the recordings, or what did that other key user miss? Let me test their permission sets. And they took responsibility and ownership as well of those permissions. And that was really good to see because, again, it wasn't them being burdened by this project. It was them excited to help, excited to find the issues, and also take ownership that they had done the recordings and maybe missed steps.
One sort of broader question, and we can get this makes me think of is when you have all these people from different departments working together, does it ever spark sort of larger business process debates or business process breakout projects where it's like, well, now that we're all talking to each other and seeing what each other does, sort of let's refine what we're actually trying to do here.
Yeah, I don't know if you could hear us giggling in the background when you asked that question, but I think that's definitely one of the things that comes up when a company undertakes this project is they realize maybe we don't have a set process for this, or everyone is doing a different process. Let's try to make them consistent. So that also kind of goes along with what we alluded to before of sometimes businesses don't realize how big of an undertaking it is, especially if either you're new to Business Central or your processes are not well defined and understood by everyone. So yes, that definitely does happen. And it's good to define those processes as you go through, but it also can add to the timeline of the project, obviously.
Or you may find that it's not appropriate to address it as part of this project, and you basically set it aside and put it in the parking lot, and you're going to put together a group and you're going to look at it. So that goes back to why you treat this like a project. So do I want to make the change to the internal business process that we're performing part of this project? So now it's a change to this project. Or do I set it aside and we will handle it at a later date? So this goes back to why this needs to be a project and not just something you're going to do, right? Why you need to have someone in charge.
Yep. Yep. Well, can we maybe look at what these projects actually look like in terms of the phases that they go through?
Sure.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about why to include the end users, but let's kind of hit on those points of how can you include the end users. So Cynthia and I have kind of pinpointed some main phases of the permissions and securities project, and I'll just kind of go over those, but then we'll talk in depth about each one of those and in ways that you can incorporate those key end users. So first we'll talk about planning, then we'll talk about actually creating those permissions and having the users record them. We will talk about testing, we'll talk about troubleshooting, and then ongoing support. So those are kind of the 5 main phases that we'll talk about, but we will start with planning. So Cynthia can probably tell us a little bit about creating a planning document for the project.
So when I started working with security and permissions, we thought in terms of what does a user do on a daily basis? So what pages are they going to? What cards are they opening up? Are they using customers? Are they using vendors? What reports are they running? That type of thing. And we would literally basically take an Excel spreadsheet and we would put in the first column, we'd say a customer service person, and then, so what would be the role? And then each subsequent column at the top would say edit customer, add new customer, run the aging report. So it was things that you did. And the way you thought about it was, okay, does a customer service person do these things? So you would mark off each column. And then you'd say, okay, does a salesperson do these things? And it became about the objects. And then as I started doing more and more security and permissions, and actually as Cari and I started working on some of these projects together, we started realizing that that was too granular. That was looking at it not as an end user, but as a technical person thinking about data and objects. And that's really not the best way to go about this. So that planning document turned into a document where we would say, all right, we still needed to think about the master data. We still needed, so if I'm talking to customer service, are they going to be doing things with the customer? Of course they are. What things do you do with the customer? Oh, well, we add new customers. Do you ever edit an existing customer? We do. Are you allowed to delete customers? No, we're not. Do you add dimensions to customers? No, we don't. That's finance. Are you allowed to change the dimensions on a customer? No, we don't. That's finance. So it was really about what do you do? So the master data was still a prompt to help us think about what the users did, but it was really about creating this document and setting up what users did in the system so then we could create the permission sets. Is that a good way to explain it, do you think, Cari?
I think that's great. And then, when I think about even what I do in Business Central, I kind of think of terms of what do I go in on a daily, weekly, monthly basis and do. So for me as an end user in that regard, it's easier to think of what job tasks do I perform as a whole rather than, am I reading this? Am I editing it? Am I deleting? So I think that conversation leads to those endpoints of what permissions are
Mm-hmm.
needed just by those users being able to list out their job tasks. And then we also can take those job tasks and group the ones together that make sense, and that's how we create the permission set. So the admin user will create those permission sets based on that planning document.
Right. And I think what we find is that each organization thinks about how they work a little bit differently. So if you look at it and you say, all right, like Cari said, what are the tasks that I perform? What's unique to my role, right? What should be only me doing this? What are the complicated processes? So if I have something that involves multiple steps, and do I consider all of those steps one task? So it's almost like if you have an SOP or a standard operating process document, those can be a good guideline for building out this worksheet of knowing what you need to record. Because by the way, all of this is about being able to record what the person's doing. We don't have to worry about going into this, creating permission sets and adding pages and adding objects and all that kind of stuff. We don't have to worry about that because we're
Yes.
going to actually use this recording process to do it.
Right. And I think the other thing too, Cynthia mentioned is, there may be unique or complicated processes, but also there may be some crossover of job tasks. So maybe both finance and maybe, I don't know, customer support do some of the same things on the customer card. If that's the case, you might be able to even reuse those permissions for finance for customer support as well. There also might be tasks that we would maybe assume that finance does, that customer support does, or vice versa. So maybe we just assume that the sales invoices are being posted and emailed by customer support because, right, they're the sales piece, but maybe finance is doing a final review of those documents and posting them. So if we just kind of assume the tasks that will be performed by each department, we may not have those accurate permissions. So yeah, definitely considering unique or complicated processes, any crossover of job tasks, any tasks that are not performed that maybe typically would, and then just kind of the workload of the project in general.
So if you were to envision the spreadsheet, your column A might be basically the name of the work that's being performed, which would be, let's use an example of enter a sales order. So literally you just, column A, you'd put enter a sales order. And then column B, you might have the 5 steps that are involved in entering a sales order. Because maybe you have to use standard sales codes or sales lines or whatever it's called now, recurring sales lines, I can't remember. So that's part of your process, right, is to make sure that you're inserting those on certain sales orders. That outline of the steps that you take when you do a sales order will help the user be involved in making sure that we create the right permission set for creating sales orders. So now what you've done is, again, this is that upfront planning. You create this spreadsheet of all of these tasks with the key steps that you want to remember to do that will become part of the basis for creating these permission sets.
I just want to ask, is this the same sort of approach that Cari, you showed us a screenshot of in your original article, and I think you even alluded to in the presentation that you did in terms of the structure of the document?
You're correct. I did have that kind of spreadsheet planning document as a screenshot in both the article and the webcast. So if anyone wants to see just a brief overview of that. And I think, Cynthia, you also kind of that spreadsheet that we created as a planning document, I think you share that as well when you teach the permissions and security class. And I think you've had really good feedback from companies. Even if they take it and change it a little bit, it at least
Mhm.
serves as a nice kind of starting point or guideline.
Right. Because I think what's great about Microsoft or, docs.microsoft.com is that there's all of this guidance about how to create permission sets and how to use it technically. But that planning part of it, that getting yourself organized and ready to go so that you can do the technical part isn't there.
So we have talked quite a bit about planning, and the next step after, the initial planning would be creating those permission sets and actually allowing the users to do the recording. So kind of the first thing that would happen is the admin would create the blank permission sets in Business Central. And again, these would come from that planning document of how they kind of decided to group things, tasks. And then after these blank permission sets are created, the admin would also create the user groups. So maybe one user group would be finance, maybe one would be customer support, and admin would assign those permission sets to the user groups. So now all that needs to happen once that shell is kind of set up is admin needs to work with those key end users to just show them how the permissions recording process works. They can either, just create some simple instructions. We also recommend that they walk through it with those end users for the first time. So show them once how it works, stay on the call, have each of those key end users record one or two permission sets, tasks, just so they can get comfortable with what that process looks like. And then at this point, pretty much those users are now free to go complete the rest of their recordings. So what admin would do is they would just kind of set a deadline based on their timeline and say, you have 2 weeks to finish recording all of these permissions, and then we'll move into the next phase of testing. So those are kind of the overview of steps of what that creating and recording process looks like, and it's very minimal work for that admin person.
I've actually had a little bit different take on that also, where one of the projects that I'm working on right now is the organization already has quasi permission sets set up, right, and user groups, and they know that the users still have too much access. So they are taking this approach, but because they're already up and running, they're using the system, they actually have a PC set up in the IT admin office, and the users come in to that office, they use that PC, and they use the test environment to do the recording. And the IT person is there to answer any questions, but this way they can set them up, because when we're doing this recording, they have to be super users. They have to have access to parts of the system that they wouldn't normally have access to. So this organization, because they couldn't do it effectively as part of their implementation, they have to do it down the line here. They have to take a different approach. So this is one of the benefits of doing it as part of the implementation. You can take the easier approach that Cari just described. You don't have to take the more complex approach, which is have a test system, do it in the test system, do it at, logged in as a user with super user permissions in that environment. It adds a little bit more complexity, and it takes them out of their environment, takes them away from their desk. So
That's
you
a
can
good
see
point.
it still can be done. It's not a problem. It can be done, but just not in the same way.
I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned so far, and a question that we often get, are extensions or add-ons. How do we accommodate for those in recording permissions? And
Do you want to tell the story?
Yes, I can tell the story. So we were working with a customer who had, quite a few extensions, add-ons, and we did some of the permissions recordings in their sandbox environment. We tested them with Francine from finance. Everything was good in Sandbox. And we, as part of our approach, we decided to only implement permissions in production for just one key user to make sure that they weren't having any work stopping errors. And we were glad that we did this because Francine from finance went in production when her permissions were assigned to do her work, and she got all sorts of permissions errors related to the add-ons or extensions or apps that they had integrated in their production system. And we quickly realized that none of these or minimal of these were actually linked with their Sandbox environment. So when they did the permissions recordings, the permissions from those add-ons or extensions did not get recorded. And we kind of found out a couple different ways that this could be handled. So typically when you purchase that app or that extension, you are going to get permission sets along with those. And you can add those permission sets in those different user groups. However, sometimes this can actually be a little bit too inclusive. So if there's certain things in those permission sets that came with the add-on, you maybe don't want to give those all to the users. So the other thing that can be done, rather than trying to go link all of these up in the Sandbox, would be allow that user to append to the recording of the permission set in the production environment. And to do this, all they have to do is their actual work. So in the Sandbox, they were maybe doing a task that resembled what they'd be doing in production. But if we temporarily give them all their permissions back in production, even if the admin wants to sit with them and watch them do it, that's fine. But they'll be able to start the recording, go do their actual work, so they're not wasting any time, stop the recording, and then they'll be able to get those permissions kind of added on.
Yeah, and that actually worked really, really well. And it basically alerted us to part of the planning process is to be aware of what you have in your Sandbox versus what you have in production. So if you're doing a CRM integration and you don't have a CRM integration with your Sandbox, you're going to have to do a lot of your recording in your production environment. And that just means you just need to plan differently. And that's fine.
And it can be tricky too. It's like Cynthia said with CRM. I do remember, we had a few things where we just maybe had trouble recording certain tasks. So, it might take a little bit of thinking outside of the box or a few workarounds, but we were in the end able to get everything to those users that they needed.
And what was interesting about it is because the users were involved all along, they weren't mad when this happened. They were kind of like, oh, yeah, that's right. We didn't test the CRM stuff in the Sandbox. We tested it in the production environment. Instead of, what the heck? What do you mean I can't do my job? Why is this not working? And again, it was just, I was actually amazed. I think it was a really, really good group, the one that we're thinking of in particular, but it really was a completely different, more positive result because they were so involved from the beginning.
And Cynthia just mentioned about testing. That's where we found the majority of the issues. So testing is the third phase of the project that we're going to, continue to talk about, but this is a very important phase because this can help lead to either the success or the failure of the project. And when we talk about testing, we're normally, going to do the recordings in Sandbox and test in our Sandbox. So what we recommend is, kind of sit on a call with those users that did the recordings. And maybe if you have two key users, maybe have them test each other's permission sets that they recorded, because maybe one person remembers additional steps that the person recording didn't. So if you do have two users, we recommend that. But the admin person can kind of sit on a call, have them test through. If they get any errors, that the admin can resolve those right away. They can either add that single permission set that they're getting the error for, or permission, I'm sorry, not permission set, or they can temporarily give those users the ability to, have super user permissions and append to the recordings. Because as a rule of thumb, I think Cynthia, we usually say, if you've encountered permissions error messages and you've added more than 3 things, maybe it's time to actually append to that recording instead of just going through and adding all those little things.
Yes, absolutely.
And Cari, is this the point that you wrote about that almost seemed like a bit of a psychological detail where, you're almost definitely going to see some errors, but seeing them in the context of sort of known testing scenarios and in this testing environment, that when they arise, they don't kind of cause the frustration. They sort of are seen and handled sort of more, I don't know, proactively or with purpose rather than with frustration.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think that requires a little bit of just kind of work on the admin side to let those users know, hey, it's not going to be perfect. You are going to have error messages, especially when you're testing in Sandbox, but maybe also in production. So I think preparing those users for what the project is actually going to look like and letting them know that it's not going to be perfect also kind of prepares them for that testing phase and getting those error messages. But definitely I think that the users become more comfortable with the error messages and what's needed to resolve those when they can test through it with the admin and kind of see what's happening again in the background and get comfortable with it.
It was interesting too, because one of the things that you can do is record a few of the permission sets and then allow them to test those, because they get to see the results of the work that they did. Then it becomes a contest. Can I create permission sets and do it well enough that when it gets tested, nobody finds anything? And it was kind of interesting to see this kind of like competitiveness that came out in some of the people. I don't if you remember, Cari, we had 2 senior customer service people at the one organization, and one of them, and I can't remember, it was Carl. He was like, "Oh, I got through it all the way and there were no problems. Ha ha ha. You missed something." And they were having fun. And it was like, okay, wait a minute. Fun, permissions. How does that go together?
Cari, I thought I heard you mention at some point that can actually be a bit of a warning sign too. If you have no errors, you might be over permissioned.
That's true.
That's a great point. And this kind of goes back to something I'd mentioned before. A lot of companies we work with say, well, we don't want to spend a lot of time on permissions, but we want them to be right. And sometimes what those organizations will end up doing is giving too many permissions because they don't want those users to come across error messages. So that's actually a really great point. If you're not getting any permissions errors at all, you might want to kind of double check and make sure that those users not only that they can do what they need to do, but that they can't do what they shouldn't do. So I think, Jason, the question that we've gotten, even in the webcast, was how do we know that these users aren't going off and recording something that they shouldn't be so that they have all of these permissions now? Well, that's why the testing phase is so important.
Mhm.
And when the admin is sitting on that call during the initial testing, what I'd kind of recommend is have them test through a couple of the permission sets until they get comfortable with it. They can, if they're trusted, they can finish the testing on their own, but also have those users try to do things that they shouldn't be doing. Try to have them go into setup screens, try to have them post things they shouldn't, because this also helps ensure that, they're not going to be doing things that they shouldn't, and just that those permission sets aren't too broad and too inclusive of tasks that they don't need. So that's why we think the testing is so important.
So tests where the successful outcome is you don't have the access, or you get a denied message, or you don't see certain fields, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. So not only testing to say, do we have the permissions we need, but also, can we do things we shouldn't do? And if so, what do we need to do to remedy that?
Like deleting a customer, right? So make sure if they're not allowed to delete a customer record, part of the testing is go try to delete a customer record.
And, if that user can do something that they shouldn't be, it's not necessarily that they did it intentionally that it was included. Maybe they, you shouldn't just assume that, oh, they recorded this because they wanted to be able to do this, even though they shouldn't. It might have just gotten recorded or incorporated through some other process that they were doing. So that's why it's, again, so important to test through those.
Well, and I think that goes to part of the troubleshooting too. The person may be able to delete the customer record not because of the permission sets they recorded, but because of some other permission set that they've been assigned through some other process. So it really is a matter of determining, there's tools that we can use when we're looking at effective permissions on users. And I will say that when it comes to troubleshooting, effective permissions is probably, I don't know, I think it's one of the best tools out there because it'll show you what permission sets have given the user the ability to delete the customer.
Yes, I completely agree with Cynthia. We use that screen all the time when we were trying to figure out why they had those certain permissions. And so just one last point on testing. I kind of mentioned this, but I just want to reemphasize when it comes time to put those permission sets into production, maybe they've been completely tested through in Sandbox, everything is working well. Don't just assign those permission sets user groups to all of the 10 finance users right away. Assign them to those 1 to 2 key users that tested in Sandbox to work through any kinks in production, and then maybe extend it to all of the users, maybe add 3 a week, whatever it may be, because that might also help identify if other users are maybe doing different things, or again, is the process the same for everyone? So don't just, once you have everything recorded and tested, don't just dump it all into production. Still do that in kind of a little bit of a phased approach.
Well, and what's really, oh, I'm sorry, Jason.
I just want to know, in doing that, like you just described, Cari, is that sort of a bit of an organizational technique where your admin is sort of checking in with those key people and doing verification that way, or is there sort of a technical validation point that you would say before you make the decision to roll out those permissions to more users?
I think thinking back to the project that we helped with, our kind of rules of thumb was if those users could maybe get through a whole week of job tasks without permissions messages, or with very minimal permissions messages that we were able to resolve, we felt comfortable extending those permission sets to other users. So for us, it wasn't really anything technical or planned on a specific, timeline, but it was more so like when we feel comfortable with what's right, let's extend that to other users, because we didn't want to rush things and get frustrated users. We wanted it to be right. Cynthia, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
That's exactly what we did. And the other thing that I wanted to add was, don't forget when we talked about taking something from 4.5 months to 2 months, while we have somebody testing in the Sandbox, someone else is planning their task list. While someone is testing in production and we're testing those 2 users, we decide that, okay, we've gone a week without any real issues, so we can add a couple more users. Well, at that time that we add additional users in finance, we might be adding our first users in customer service. So this is one of those things where you need to make sure that you don't overload the admin or the person who's in charge. So that's another indicator. So we may be ready because we haven't had any errors in a week or any messages, anything work stopping in a week, but maybe the IT admin who's in charge of the whole project isn't ready to add on some additional users yet. So you need to keep that in mind too, because we don't want to overload that person.
Right, because end users will get frustrated if, say at 8 o'clock this morning, I get a permissions error message, I forward it on to the admin, and maybe tomorrow afternoon, I still haven't heard back because they're too overloaded working through other phases or working through other error messages. We need to make sure that admin person is not overloaded so that they can actually give the attention needed to those end users, because otherwise they may become frustrated. So kind of feeling out what that timeline looks like and what that admin person is comfortable with at
Right,
that
and
point.
it's laying out the expectations too, as Cari mentioned earlier. Anything in production is priority over a problem in test. So if we have users testing permissions in the test environment and they run into a problem, but we have someone in production who runs into a problem, of course, that's a priority. So that's where the team or the individual who's in charge of this project needs to set the expectations and keep the priorities straight. So it is still a tough job. It is, and again, it's a reason it needs to be a project.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us into our fourth phase of troubleshooting. And when we look at troubleshooting, it's going to be, okay, well, are the users getting permissions error messages? How do we resolve those in a timely manner? Also, how do we know that those users should have those permissions? So kind of coming up with a plan of troubleshooting, whether it be, there's 10 users in finance. Francine is maybe the head of kind of that that finance group, and Fred gets a permissions error message because he thinks he should be doing something. Maybe there's kind of a chain of approval where Fred needs to send a screenshot of that error message to Francine and say, hey, this is what I was trying to do. This is why I think I should be doing this. And then Francine can then escalate that to admin if she believes it's a permission that should be added. If it's something where Fred was doing the wrong process, like Cynthia mentioned before, or something that Fred shouldn't be doing, Francine can be the one to say, okay, no, let me show you how to do it instead, or that's not something you should be doing. Because really, those admin users, they don't know whether the permission should be added or not. You could get all sorts of users saying, hey, I need this, I need this, I need this. So having some sort of kind of chain of command of that approval process can be very important as well. And then by the time that permissions error message makes its way to the admin, it's already been vetted. They know that, yes, this is something I need to add. So they don't have to do that work of tracking down Francine and saying, hey, Fred requested permission for this. Is it something he should have? So it kind of just, takes also some of the work away from that admin person.
Well, and it goes back to that example with Carl where he was saying, well, in the old system, I did this. And it was like Susan said, well, guess what? In the new system, you don't. So that would have been another example of, in that department, Susan would be the person who would vet whether or not Carl should have those permissions. And then based on what Susan decides, it goes to the IT admin to change the permissions or give them the opportunity to record again.
Exactly. So kind of troubleshooting and ongoing support are going to continue to be two important pieces of the project. I think that's another thing that maybe can be kind of a misconception about a security and permissions project, is that it's not just going to be, okay, 2 months and then we're done forever. People's roles will change. There will be new users. There's going to be, onboarding, crossover of job positions. So it's going to continue to be ongoing maintenance. And I think that's something that's important to understand, is it's not just going to be all of a sudden done and we can forget about it. It will be it'll be important to continue to maintain those permissions. Maybe new functionality is added, things like that.
That goes back to whether it's new functionality because you start using different parts of the system, or because we have Business Central and Azure and we are constantly seeing the application improved and additional tools that we can use to perform our job more effectively. But it also it goes all the way back to the planning stage. And I think if you kind of think in terms about job roles changing or even coverage for vacation. So one of the things that I will do is I'll bring up the example of, you have an AP person and you have an AR person. And in organization 1. Organization 2 has someone that does AP and AR. But when I'm talking to organization 2, I might say, all right, so Francine, right now you have one person who's doing AP and AR. How's that going? Oh my gosh, she's overwhelmed. We're looking to hire someone. Well, if that's the case, then when I do my recordings and when I create my permission sets and when I structure my user groups, I might actually want to create an AP user group and an AR user group and assign both of those to my current user. But when I hire the AR person, I can take the AR away from my current person and give it to the new person. So when I'm planning, I need to think in terms of, will these responsibilities possibly be segregated in the future? If so, I might want to create smaller task-oriented permission sets. So we talked about it a little bit about creating all these different permission sets, but you can actually become more efficient with more permission sets because you can compartmentalize or segregate tasks more easily. And you can use that too for vacation. So now that I have an AP person and an AR person, I have permission sets for AR and for AP. But when my AR person is on vacation, my AP person has those responsibilities. I can temporarily assign that user group to my AP person, so they now do AP and AR.
Absolutely. And I think that that ongoing support becomes less tedious and less time consuming if the time and effort was put in upfront in the permissions and security project, because unfortunately we have seen companies where maybe they rushed to do the project, they're just overwhelmed with users getting error messages, so they decide that, okay, we're going to pull an Oprah and we're going to just give everyone super user permission, so you get super and you get super. And maybe they even think too that they're going to temporarily give super user permissions, and then, oh, in a week I'll have time to figure out what the issue was and resolve it. And then maybe they just either don't have time or they forget to go back and take those super user permissions away. So that ongoing maintenance becomes more sustainable, I think, if that time and commitment is put in upfront in the project. And I have to admit that I stole the Oprah thing from Cynthia.
Well, I will tell you that when I've gone into organizations and done an assessment of the utilization of their system, and I'll ask them if they've implemented security and permissions, and they will invariably, I'd say 75% of them will say yes, they have. And then we do a little of an investigation, and I will notice that 90% of their users have super user. It's like,
That's very scary.
Yeah, it is. It's what's scarier than the fact that they are super users is the fact that the person that I asked who's in charge thought they had their system locked down with permissions. So it's not the 90% that are super that's scary. It's the fact that it wasn't realized that 90% of them are super users.
And Jason, that almost circles back to what you said before of, should users be a little bit, or admin be a little bit concerned if there are absolutely no permissions error messages and they think that they've fully implemented permissions? That's probably a good indicator, that they do have too many. So maybe that company thought, oh man, nobody's getting permissions errors. Everyone can do their jobs. This is great. Like, we effectively implemented security and permissions, where really it could have been a warning sign of, maybe we need to investigate why there are no error messages and see if users are able to do things that they're not.
Well, I don't know that I completely agree.
That's okay, Cynthia.
I think early on, I agree that, you're going to end up with permission errors. But you should get to a point. I don't want anyone to think that they're not going to get to a point where users can do their job without an error message. You're absolutely going to get there. But if they start investigating around and exploring and getting messages, then you've got them locked down properly.
Yes.
Well, if someone's listening to this and they're saying, "Oh no, could I have that kind of situation where I thought I think I have security and permission set up properly, but maybe my system's wide open." What are there quick things you can do to check, or is that a more complicated thing that you need to approach?
So what I would say is it might not be a bad idea to two ideas, kind of test with two admin users. So Cynthia and I, if we are both admin, Cynthia could maybe log in as a certain user and test out, or even log in as herself, but I'll assign her a certain user group. So say we're trying to test out finance permissions to make sure that the users don't have access for certain things. I can go in as an admin and I can assign Cynthia the finance user group and any other additional permission sets. Now Cynthia can go in and remove anything else. Now Cynthia can go in while I'm on the call with her and she can test out, okay, can I change this thing I shouldn't? Can I change general ledger setup? So that's a way to test without involving the users, just kind of by doing it with two admin people. And Cynthia and I have actually done that as well when we're maybe trying to troubleshoot something, because maybe we don't want to interrupt the daily work of the user to ask them to help us with this. So we can do that on our own with those user groups and permission sets that we've set up. I think the other way that I can think of is just having maybe like a 20-minute call with the finance users and say, hey, we just want to check and make sure our permissions are correct, make sure there's no holes in them. Would you mind in production trying, or, sandbox maybe, going and trying to do these things and see if you can do them. In production, you could have them try to access areas of the system that they shouldn't to check that. Obviously, they shouldn't be, posting or doing any tasks in production that they wouldn't normally do. But I think that's the other way, is let the end users know that you are kind of taking a double check of security and permissions to make sure that there's nothing being missed on the back end, and having them test through those. So those are kind of the two ways that I can think of.
There's also, if you go into the permission area for the user setups, there are ways to use different list pages and grids to see if the super permission set has been assigned to users. So using some of those, they're basically pages that will list permissions or permission sets and user groups that are assigned. So you can look and see that, oh, look, we've got 30 people with super assigned to them. I would very quickly go in and look at that. That's usually the problem. Go ahead.
Well, I would also just say, don't assume that just because the users don't have super user permissions that they don't have too many permissions. Because
That's true.
A lot of, maybe the business premium or a lot of those permission sets might be inclusive of things they don't need. So that's a great place to start, I think, by checking, because yes, absolutely not everyone should have super, but also looking at those other permission sets that may have things that are
Cari,
too much.
that is an absolutely excellent point, because the permissions of the user group that is assigned automatically when the user is provided with a license at the admin level in 365 in Azure. So you assign a license for Business Central. At that time, a user group with permission sets is assigned to that user that is the equivalent of a super user. So Cari, that's a fabulous point. So that entitlement permission or user group is like giving somebody super user. So when you are attaching these new user groups to the users, you need to remember to take that one off, because that is their superpowers basically from their license entitlement. Great point, Cari. I'm glad you brought that up.
And this is why Cynthia and I work so well together. And I'm sure we could probably talk for 10 hours about permissions.
Yes.
But Jason, now that we've kind of talked through how we can include the users in the different phases, are there any other questions that you have as follow-up for us?
I would just love for you to go over one thing that came up during the webcast, a question about, the idea of what do you do with executives at the organization who want to be a part of the action, but maybe aren't real users in the sense of what you've been describing so far?
That was a great question. I do remember that one. So a lot of times with executives or C-suite level, the original thought will be, well, let's just give them everything because it's okay for them. They're not going to do anything to harm the company, whatever. It's fine for them to have all the permissions. Maybe also, well, we don't want them to come across error messages because we really don't want to waste their time. So sometimes maybe this is the right approach, but in my experience, a lot of the times we do not want those executives or those C-suite level users going in and maybe posting journal entries or posting documents. So what I found is that a good place to start would be creating a permission set or a user group with read-only permissions for everything, and also giving them access to run all reports. So that will allow them to view everything, run reports on data in the system, but not change, modify, post, delete anything. And the other thing that can be done kind of proactively is reach out to those different executive users and say, is there anything you do in the system that's not just viewing data or running reports? Maybe they're doing AP approvals or something like that. Then you can kind of tailor those different permission sets to the tasks that those users are doing. And sometimes too, if maybe the executives just don't have the capacity to be able to sit in a planning meeting and then do recordings and things like that, that's okay, because as long as you know what those executives are doing, maybe an admin person can go in and do the recordings for that. So that's kind of an approach that I found works for executives. But Cynthia, I'll see if you have anything to add.
I think the only thing I would add is that we have opportunities to, in their dashboard, give them cash flow forecasting, that type of thing. Again, those are typically reports. They're consumers of the data, they don't generate the data. So that approach of that read only, setting up their dashboard with the charts or graphs that they're looking for, scheduling reports to run for them really isn't a security and permission thing. But if they have the ability to use all the reports that and the ability to access the job queue scheduler, then the reports can be scheduled. And most of the time, I think your non-C-suite managers are appreciative of them being able to get all the data they want without messing with the setup, because that can be a big problem. Somebody says, oh, I'm just going to go in and change this. I'm going to play with this because I can. And again, you're protecting those executives from modifying information or data that has an impact that they didn't expect. And by giving them the read only, you're protecting your system.
Right. I think the other thing, though, Jason, you said, what if those executives or C-suite want to be involved in the project? That's awesome because you can kind of include them. They can get a feel for what this project really is and how inclusive it is, the amount of detail that's needed. So it's great if they do want to be involved because then they can understand, what's happening in the background, how is this impacting the people who are involved in the project. So I think that if they do want to be involved, that's a really great thing.
Well, good note to end on. This is not an IT project. It's an enterprise-wide project.
Absolutely.
And that
one of the
top to
things I had
bottom.
jotted down was this is as much organizational change management as it is, obviously practical security rules and setup too, which is obviously critical. But so much of what you've been talking about just lands on that side of the organizational change and managing that, which is its own skill set that just comes through here so strongly.
And hopefully we've provided you with some kind of tips and thoughts on how you can successfully involve those key end users in a successful permissions and security project.
Yeah, this has been super valuable. I think anyone who's been listening can really get so much out of what you've been sharing here, as well as in the article and the video, which we'll link to, or the webcast, which is recorded as a video, and we'll link to those. Are there any other resources you wanted to mention or anything else that's related to this that you wanted to call listeners' attention to?
The only thing that I will add is make sure to stay up to date with the new release notes for Business Central, because Microsoft is constantly looking for ways to improve upon the existing functionality in Business Central. And one of the big focuses has been permission. So I know with the Wave 1 release, they've added a few new things. So just make sure that you're staying up to date with those new releases. And also, if there's something that you do not like in the system, make sure that you go to that, I think it's the Microsoft Ideas page for Business Central, and see if it's an idea out there that's been posted by somebody else, or add a new idea as a suggestion of how they can improve the features, because they're constantly looking to try to make things easier for us.
And then in addition to that, there are organizations like New View Strategies and others that either provide training related to permissions and security, or even there's a few apps out there that extend how permissions work. For example, right now we can only set permissions on an entire table. So how do you get field level security? So I know that there's some apps out there for that. So just because it's not in the base application, don't assume that someone hasn't extended it. But I think the Docs.Microsoft does a good job of giving you basic technical information, but you really need to read the articles that are out there. Jason, I think Cari's aren't probably the only ones in MSDW that are about security and permissions. So use the community as a resource in addition to the apps and what Microsoft provides. And like Cari said, keeping up with the releases is really, really important. And I think it really just comes down to, and by the way, don't be afraid to ask questions in some of the forums in the community, because you can get help and different perspective. Cari and I aren't the only ones working in setting up permissions in Business Central. So I'm sure that there's a lot of knowledge out there where you can learn directly by the mistakes that we've made over the years, because this whole approach that we have grew into this approach. We didn't start doing it this way.
And the last thing that I will add is you may find with some of the other resources out there, not everyone will agree with Cynthia and I on including the end users or, how this process looks. So find what's best for your organization and use that. But this is what we in our experience have found to be successful. But just know that there are other approaches out there. There's going to be lots of information on other ways to go about this as well.
But we still think ours is the righter way.
We do.
Oh, I do want to say one more thing. When I was at Directions, which is our partner conference, and attended the session about security and permissions with the Microsoft product managers for this area, they did not talk a lot about the recorder. And as they were going through the changes that were being made, afterwards, I stepped aside with one of the gentlemen, and I asked him, I said, here's the approach that we take, and here's why. Is this still a valid approach with the changes that you're making? And his comment was, absolutely. If this is the approach you're taking, it will still work with the changes that we are making. We didn't bring up the recorder because we didn't make changes in the recorder. We just made changes in some of the structure of permission sets and the way they relate to each other. So, keep that in mind. Just because you see something new coming through doesn't mean the tried and true doesn't still work.
Great point.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks once again to Cynthia and Cari for being here. Check out the show notes for more on the related article and webcast recording we are referring to in this episode. You can also reach out to Cari by email, cari@getyournewview.com, or through their website, which is also getyournewview.com. And that's it for this episode. If you want to reach out to me, it's jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. And you can follow us for all of our updates on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.